start our session and then hopefully have some time left to discuss questions and opinions with you, our audience. But first of all, allow me to give a very brief introduction to the topic. It might have come as a surprise to you that trade policy has been integrated into this event and, in fact, into a number of national feminist foreign policies so far. So allow me to make this nexus between gender and trade a little bit more clear, at least from an academic perspective. And Gea will then continue and enlighten us from a NGO's perspective as well. So at the heart of trade law and policy, there's this promise that the liberalization of trade will benefit everybody involved and that welfare gains are distributed in an equal manner. This is a long-standing assumption, basically going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, these old economic philosophers. And it was underpinned by the belief that trade policy is genuinely gender neutral. However, as feminists, and as we have established this morning already in detail, we know that there are no gender-neutral social spaces. Each and every political action has an impact on existing gender relations. In the same way, trade policy can both work to promote gender equality or perpetuate and reinforce negative effects. So, just to mention some positive effects of trade policy and how trade can impact positively on women. So foreign trade can increase women's wages as firms that export pay more and offer better working conditions than the firms that do not export. The liberalization of trade has also helped to introduce new technologies that can benefit women-owned businesses. And at the household level, trade liberalization can prove beneficial by lowering prices of goods women generally purchase. However, in recent years, research has also shown that trade laws and policies discriminate against women and girls both in direct or more frequently in indirect, unintentional ways. One obvious way to discriminate against women is to set different standards for men and women. So this is something that has, for instance, been demonstrated in customs policy with a phenomenon also known as pink tariffs. Gender-specific evaluation of customs tariffs have shown that in countries such as the USA or Switzerland, different tariffs apply to comparable products for male and female consumers, even though there is no objective difference between these products, with women ending up paying higher prices. But even supposedly neutral trade policies can perpetuate discrimination against women, for example, by shaking up established markets that are particularly relevant to women. For instance, while trade liberalization leads to the creation of new job opportunities for women, we rarely find women in better paid positions, such as higher management in companies. Instead, most of these new jobs emerge in low-wage sectors such as agriculture, tourism, or the garment industry. Oftentimes, conditions in these jobs are precarious, and sexual harassment and violence are part of everyday life for many employees. As wage workers, women often have neither the technical skills nor the organizational structures to defend themselves against exploitative working conditions. This phenomenon is also known as the feminization of labor, meaning that there is both an increase in female employment and a worsening of their working conditions and wages. That there's an increased risk for women and girls to be exploited is particularly evident when we look at recent statistics on modern slavery. In 2016, 14 million people found themselves in situations amounting to modern slavery globally. And 71% of these people were female. Furthermore, a lot of jobs that women work in are particularly prone to crisis. This was illustrated most clearly recently by the COVID pandemic, which has led to a significant increase in unemployment and poverty among women and girls. And although many male workers were also affected, women are clearly lagging behind and find it more challenging to re-enter the job market. Now, I also would like to add a few words on female care work, thereby broadening the perspective a little bit, because if we discuss women's work, we cannot ignore all these countless hours of unpaid work at home and for the family. A United Nations data collection from 90 countries has shown that women worldwide spend an average of 3 hours more than men per day on care work. In other words, all these activities related to running a private household, caring for relatives, bringing up children, and other chores. This huge amount of time is missing for paid work, leisure, education, professional training, and the maintenance of social and professional networks. So all these observations are worrisome both from a human rights and an economic standpoint. First of all, women have a human right to have equal access to economic resources and to participate in economic life. This right is stipulated most prominently in Article 13 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Women from 1979, which enjoys a virtually universal status of ratification. However, discriminating laws and policies and structural inequalities continue to violate fundamental human rights as guaranteed by the UN Women's Rights Convention, as well as fundamental labor rights, which the International Labour Organization has fought for well over a century. In addition to the question of economic rights and justice, the gendered nature of trade has serious economic repercussions. It is a fact that women make up more than half of the world's labor force. However, they contribute only 37% of the gross global product. In 2015, the consulting firm McKinsey conducted a study to evaluate the actual economic losses caused by gender inequality. They concluded that global GDP could be increased by 12 trillion US dollars by 2025 if, I quote, all countries were to match the progress towards gender parity of the best performers in their region. So not in the world, but in their region. So to me, it is clear that policymakers should assign a high priority to gender justice, not only due to human rights considerations, but also for economic reasons. And this thought also underpinned the UN Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development, which has set out to achieve gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls in SDG 5. So luckily, in trade law and policy, there are many suitable pathways we could explore here. Free trade agreements and supply chain regulations are two suitable points of departure, as both areas are already quite well researched. Other areas that are perhaps equally important have often been overlooked, also due to a general lack of data. So beyond free trade agreements and supply chain regulation, a gender perspective could also be important, for instance, in the areas of public procurement, dispute regulation, or investment treaty law. Another important field of action are multilateral processes, especially within the WTO, to reduce gender-specific trade barriers and to move towards a gender-transformative design of economic systems. So, to conclude, certainly many aspects and questions we could discuss here, and in order to do so, I will now hand over to my fellow speakers for their interventions, and we will start with Inma Rodriguez Pinheiro. Inma, you have the floor.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the Foundation for European Progressive Studies for organizing this conference and for inviting me to participate in it. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this project along with the rest of the panelists and the rest of the public, and to address the crucial issue of untangling gender bias in EU trade policy. Let me start by saying that when I arrived at the European Parliament in 2014, the gender perspective was of no interest to trade policy, even though trade is an essential instrument for economic growth, as you have already mentioned, and that empirical evidence shows that countries that enjoy greater gender equality are more prosperous and competitive, where poverty rates decline the most, leading to more inclusive and efficient societies. But in 2014, and for some years after, the representatives of the European Commission and the majority of MEPs considered that trade policy was neutral and had nothing to do with promoting gender equality. It was the same coming from WTO. And I asked, nothing to do? Let's consider, for example, the textile sector and the situation of working women in Bangladesh. Let us remember the collapse of the Rana Plaza building, which resulted in more than 1,500 victims, almost all of them women. And let us reflect. Could a European regulation that would force importing companies to be more responsible have any impact on the situation of Bangladeshi seamstresses? Should the reduction of tariffs on textiles be conditional on the application of ILO conventions on safety work and decent work in Bangladesh? For those whose answer is affirmative, trade policy is logically not neutral. Time has proved us right. The role of the European Parliament in calling for such measures is essential, and the response of the European Commission is determinant, although it has not been enough. As the previous introduction already explained, the liberalization of trade has a gender differentiated impact both within and outside of Europe. It can increase employment and improve working conditions in certain sectors, but it can also exert pressures that negatively affect women's employment and wages in other countries. In particular, in developing countries, the new jobs created for women are often low skilled, labor intensive, and poorly paid, as in the textile, clothing, and agricultural sectors, as you just also mentioned in your introductory remarks. It's imperative that we tackle this issue to ensure that women enjoy equal access to the benefits of trade liberalization just as men do. So you must wonder, what is the EU doing in these regards? As I have already said, and I would like to highlight, historically, trade policy has been perceived as one of the areas of EU policy blind to gender issues. The connection between trade and the situation of women was not apparent, and there was little interest in integrating such considerations into trade agreements. In 2017, a review of the 32 agreements the EU had at the time revealed that very few references were made to women, and those that did exist were mostly related to development cooperation rather than integrated into the core trade provisions. Obviously, none formed part of the compliance monitoring mechanism or implementation measures. However, in recent years, there has been a shift towards more explicit inclusion of gender in EU trade policy, although it is not deeply enough. Currently, of all free trade agreements in force, around one third have at least one explicit provision relating to gender equality. One third only, with different scopes and depths, but all at least recognizing this link that was neglected some years before. This shift is particularly evident in the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which contains an extensive article on trade and gender, and also the new EU-Chile Free Trade Agreement, which puts a full chapter dedicated to gender equality, a first in the EU's history. I have to remind you that in the last legislature, when it was agreed that Chile should have a gender chapter, I was the rapporteur of the European Parliament. Cecilia Malmström was the Commissioner for Trade, Arantxa González, the Director of the International Trade Center, and Michelle Bachelet was the President of Chile. Without the drive of all of us and our firm commitment to incorporate a gender chapter into the agreement, and the back of a lot of feminist organizations, it would have been impossible. Gender provisions underscore the importance of applying a gender perspective to trade issues and commit parties to implement relevant international instruments while promoting gender equality through cooperation activities. As a member of the European Parliament and one of the gender mainstreaming coordinators in the International Trade Committee, I am proud to say that this shift was achieved in part thanks to the push from our institution, particularly with our resolution in 2018 calling for a stronger gender equality dimension in the EU trade policy and trade agreements. We advocate for the inclusion of a dedicated gender chapter with commitments on gender equality and women's empowerment, including clear provisions for monitoring and compliance. We insisted that trade agreements should include binding and enforceable gender provisions that go beyond the trade and sustainable development chapter. This point is key to avoid merely declaratory text. I think this is a very important key point. The Parliament also called for gender issues to be integrated throughout the process of negotiation, monitoring, and implementation. This means striving for balanced gender representation in trade negotiation teams, joint committees, expert groups, domestic advisory groups, and dispute resolution bodies. If there are not women involved in this procedure, it will be very difficult to achieve to better regulation on gender and trade in free trade agreements. In this regard, it is crucial to mention that it is key to identify specific impacts on women by including gender perspective in sustainable impact assessments and ex post evaluations, supported by disaggregated data. This is also another very important issue. We need to have clear disaggregated data in order to make good impact assessments that would be helpfully for increase the way we are going to try to help women to benefit from the free trade agreements. Let me give you an example. The evaluation of the implementation of the EU-Mexico trade agreement. In this impact assessment, it was concluded that a negative impact on the rights of women was highly unlikely, and that in the long run, trade liberalization can decrease gender discrimination by promoting more equal practices in industry. We've come a long way from a time when gender considerations were largely absent from trade agreements, and we should acknowledge the positive shift. However, it is important to recognize that the strength and scope of these commitments vary, and almost no trade agreements so far contemplates how gender-related commitments could be implemented or enforced effectively. In conclusion, much work remains to be done. We must continue to push for stronger commitments, effective implementation, and gender inclusive practices. You can count on me to continue working in the same directions, a fair and just system where women are included. And let me suggest it to you for the end that tomorrow in Inter Committee there will be a very interesting gender hearings with very good examples of how women can benefit and can profit from free trade agreements if we allow her to have the adequate framework to benefit for this. We have very good women, very good entrepreneurs, very good initiatives, and we need to help them to increase a lot in order non-women could allow outside of these benefits. Thank you very much, and I am very happy to listen the rest of the panelists and then to have an interchange with our public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Inma. I hope you could hear the applause in the room.
Yes.
Thanks for already pointing out several achievements that the EU could have during the last years with regard to gender and trade, but you also pointed to some of the remaining obstacles and challenges in this regard. And now I would like to hand over to Gea Myers, who will report to us a little bit more on the actual facts that are behind this quite complex issue.
Try this one. Okay, now it's working, sorry. Yeah, thank you for giving me the mic, and thank you so much, Friedrich Ebert-Stiftung, the EU Brussels office, for inviting me and for having this talk. The FES has done really for a long time. You have focused on promoting a gender equality perspective on trade, and this is one example of the spaces that you use for this awareness raising and exchange of ideas. So that's really appreciated. Yeah, I would like to say that from our perspective, from a civil society association, especially a feminist association network, we have really pushed and asked in the different governmental processes in Germany, in the Netherlands, for really an inclusion of trade issues in feminist foreign policy agendas. And specifically because, you know, without addressing the global socio-economic world order, we cannot really promote a feminist foreign policy. So we really need to kind of look at the key policy areas in our economic domain, and trade is really one of them. So that's why it is very important to include a gender perspective in trade and to include trade policy in a feminist foreign policy formulation and approach. And we have already talked a bit on the role of women, that they are more in the care sector, unpaid and paid, that we as women, you know, are really in that domain. It's the care economy is also come from feminist economics. I mean, that says a lot about our global, very roughly, our global gendered inequality when it comes to socioeconomic dimensions. But it's, and therefore it's very important to focus on trade policy. And also in this slide, this is where we see an inequality in our economies. So it really puts the highlight on, you know, how does our economies create or sustain inequality, or does it reduce inequality in general and from a gendered perspective, and also then looking at other categories like for migrant women, LGBTQI+ people, how is it affecting increasing or decreasing inequality? And when we look then at trade policies, we see that there has been really a huge development over the past 30 years with the establishment of the WTO, with the EU going into formulations of ongoing bilateral trade agreements. And we see that while previous trade negotiations focused really on a reduction of tariffs, on the basic elements of where you would start to agree on trade policies. We are now into a phase where also the EU is really promoting other kinds of policies. So we're talking about harmonizations of national laws, opening up now closed markets like services, healthcare, should it be an international market? We're talking about how we go, what are our global rules of using internet, who can process what data. The current trade policy is really evolved from focusing merely on tariffs to really discussing many and negotiating many domains. And in this, we already mentioned what is very visible is the feminization of labor. But you can, in this new developments in policy or in trade policy, you can also think of other common features. So, for example, the EU is very keen to promote access to raw materials. Of course, we all know all the discussions about deforestation, but you can also think about how access to raw materials, also in promotion of our Green Deal, for example, lithium, which is very important now in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Lithium extraction is also negatively impacting human rights and women's indigenous rights. That is one example of where an EU policy impacts women on the ground negatively, and where we can have a discussion on what can be done. With this, we see often, this is also visible, for example, in the related sustainable impact assessment for the EU-Mercosur region. There is indeed jobs for women, especially in the low-wage, precarious sectors. But where are the jobs to really develop an economy? Where are the industrialized jobs? Are we going for a trade model in which the EU is promoting access to raw materials, getting cheap labor from the majority world, and then adding the high, costly, that is highly remunerated value here in the global north? So what is the kind of trade model that we are promoting? And with this, what is also important to note is that when we're looking at many women are in exporting zones, they're also, especially in the developing countries, many women are essential in making sure the families and the communities have food. So there are a majority of small-scale farming in many developing countries. And there are also many cases in which there is the European trade policy has brought in products from European farmers, which are heavily subsidized and then outcompete the local farming. So that is also, for example, a negative impact that is seen at different countries. The different, for example, intellectual property rights, I think our MEP Rodriguez mentioned it here. That is also a domain where we can really talk about how accessible is healthcare for all the women that are needing it. We did a webinar recently with, or last year with migrant and indigenous women in Mexico. And they were talking about how international trade had impacted their lives. And this is really from the grassroots, how from their perspective, what was happening in their countries and in their surroundings. And they were talking in Mexico about how they lost access to land, access to water, because it was now made available to companies. And instead of having this livelihood from the land, they were now working in these companies, where they were also then reliant on cheaper but less healthy food from the US and from Europe, and that they were working in poor conditions without having any access to rights. So they were fighting for labor rights, but they were denied. They had people in their families being sick, or they were themselves sick, and they couldn't really solve any of these problems. And so that was an example of how trade policy negatively impacted women in Mexico. And I think a key question that we as feminists time and time ask ourselves, of course, trade can be beneficial to a certain group of women, but what are the women we prioritize in having benefits from trade? So for a feminist perspective, it's really about promoting a trade policy that is beneficial for the poorest of women, to make sure that these women have a decent life, to make sure that their human rights are respected. And then we can have a discussion about maybe better off women that can also benefit of trade. But I think it's really important to look at, how the trade is actually impacting these women on the ground that are having the most difficult circumstances. So that is from very short something about how trade policy is impacting, from a feminist perspective, women, and what we see as a key road ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gea. So I just noticed that the example of Mexico already came up twice. Once when Inma mentioned the sustainability impact assessment done on the EU-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, and then again with your example, of the women in Mexico and intellectual property rights. Very interesting how it all comes together. I hope we have time to get back on this. But now I'm very happy to hand over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Catherine West. I'm a Labour Member of Parliament in the UK Parliament, in the House of Commons, which is the lower house. And I'm also joined by another elected member, Councillor Peymana Assad, who sat here. And we're the two from the UK here. We are part of and Anna Joy, who I didn't see before. Welcome, Anna Joy. And we three are here with a group called the Fabian Society, which is one of the little symbols on your agenda. And the Fabian Society is the progressive think tank in UK politics. So obviously in the UK Parliament, we're the only major party to have an all-women shortlist to bring up to 50% of all Labour women. And that accounts for why we have 32% of all MPs in the House of Commons as women. If Labour didn't have those progressive politics, we would have under 20% of MPs in the UK who would be women. So it does count to vote for a progressive party if you're a woman. I briefly wanted to talk about the 3 Ps: people, processes and programs. So we've heard from Inma, who obviously knows a lot about trade, and we know there are other high-profile women. For example, we know Madam Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Cecilia Maestrom, Catherine Tai in the US, Kemi Badenoch, who is our current UK Minister, who is Business and Trade. These are all high-profile individuals, but as other speakers have argued all day today, it's not just about a one-off. It has to be about a systematic policy approach to make sure that women are remembered at every level of trade and business. On processes, the UK will be entering into the beginning of the renegotiation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the European Union and the Commission as of next year, and we hope that we will be the government negotiating that when we have our general election, which is coming up in the next 12 months. So some of the main areas of negotiation will be the role that women play in different sectors, because with the trade of goods, we know that there are lots of women who wish to trade more with the UK and the UK into the European Union, and we have a lack of skills and training. So that's one of the big areas that I don't think we have talked about very much today. How can we increase the career opportunities for women, particularly from small and medium enterprises, so that they can compete on an equal playing field with competitors? So, for example, there's lots of years that women miss in their education due to being carers, and therefore that's something which I think all governments need to have a duty to look at, particularly around digitalisation. To pay for an IT expert when you are a small business sometimes is simply not practical. But if you can have some basic skills as an entrepreneur, it can mean that you're more competitive. So I think that would be a really interesting policy area to develop, and I'm sure that the European Union has got a policy on it, but it might be something which we could lift in the UK. We also know that when we come to looking again at the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that not just on the goods side, but also the services side, we will be looking at some of the key protections which other speakers have talked about today. So protections in social care so that social care workers are not exploited, sick pay provisions, maternity provisions, holiday payments, and ending discriminatory policies. We know that many minority women across Europe, including the UK in Europe this time, minority women, of course, are at risk from discriminatory immigration policies, often just being given opportunities in certain sectors which are all low pay, or where they might come as a spouse. And in the UK, we have quite a lot of women who come in through a sort of a worker provision, where they may be a housekeeper in a third country. The family then come to the UK to work in finance or something, and then you have a very vulnerable woman often who is then subject to certain extra special immigration provisions and that sort of thing. And I think that's an area which is quite niche, but it does often lead to the human trafficking and exploitation category. On programs, my third point, because I know that you want to get to questions, we know that in programs, whether it's the UK trading outside of the European area or the EU trading outside, Inma has already talked about Rana Plaza, the legacy of Rana Plaza, which of course is very much for the UK a huge learning lesson, where so many women were killed in an awful fire. And it's meant that large companies such as Primark, which is actually an Irish company, they have their own factories now in Bangladesh, I think they still have factories in Myanmar, question mark whether they should or not, good question, good debate. But there are increased protections for women and workers in there, and that's because there have been women parliamentarians across Europe making the case for safety for women. The other area that I briefly wanted to mention, which I think you already mentioned, was in agriculture, where there are unequal outcomes due to protections. And I think perhaps we haven't yet covered the whole area of protectionism. Inma might have mentioned it because she has more of a rounded knowledge than perhaps I do. But I think given what's happening in the USA with the green projects and the Inflation Reduction Act, which covers a lot of different trade provisions, what will be the impact of protectionism in the US? What's the impact of that on European countries? What's the impact on that in the UK, given that climate programs often do have a gender chapter in them? Who's doing the work on that? Who's evaluating it? Who's monitoring it? So that we can answer the question, for example, on Mexico, climate-financed programs in Mexico helping women or hindering women? So they're the sorts of evaluation tools that we used to be really good at in the 1980s and 90s, and I think we've got less good at. Just to give you one example from the UK, we moved a provision, an amendment to a bill on the procurement of National Health Service. The NHS is the biggest employer in Europe. It's our health service in the UK. And we moved a provision which was led by majority party members, but supported by the opposition, to prohibit the purchase of garments from the Xinjiang region of China due to the exploitation of Uyghur women or groups and the detention of population there. But there's no monitoring of that. There's no way of us as members of parliament knowing that as a result of having voted that through democratically, how much less has been purchased from that region and so on. So you can see, even where you can have a good idea in trade policy, there's not as much evaluation as what we think there should be. And I'm going to wind up there because I know that our chair wants to ask questions. So let's discover a little bit more of this detail through the question session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Great interventions, everyone. Thank you so much for all the information and experience you shared. I also have many questions to all of you, but as Inma has to leave a little bit early, I think I just give the time to the audience to ask questions, especially if you have questions that you want to ask Inma. Please just go ahead. And please don't be afraid to ask questions that maybe just are some kind of explanatory character.
Hi everyone, my name is Paimana Assad. As Catherine mentioned, I'm from the UK. My question is in regards to, obviously trade is a very complex area and a lot of people don't understand it. I guess for all three panel members. In regards to, Catherine mentioned European politicians, specifically women, pushing for protection of Bangladeshi women working in factories. But sometimes we have women working in these companies who are taking advantage of other women, specifically in the Global South, because we know that not all women support the feminist foreign policy agenda. And so how do we work around that? What is the solution around that?
Is your question directed to anyone in particular?
No.
Good question, and I think that's where we come to the policies and procedures, because we know that in any workplace it can be a system or a particular culture which needs to be tackled. So I would call for, once again, these evaluation techniques, these evaluation resources which need to go into trade arrangements, because sometimes we think once the trade deal is signed off, for example, the New Zealand one, which is considered to be best practice, and by the way, there was a Labour government when that was introduced, and sadly there isn't one there anymore. They got changed 2 weeks ago in an election where the left lost. But there will be some excellent provisions in that. But how do we ensure now that the resource is there to follow up and monitor and have an enforcement if the culture is not correct and if the system surrounding that particular policy area is not correct? Really good question.
I think there's a question in the back.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Madame from Denmark. I also have a question regarding exactly this. How do we ensure that we can actually enforce? Because with the Chile chapter on gender chapter in the Chile agreement, there are no real enforcement in the sense that, yes, it does say that there are expert groups and that people have to evaluate, but how do we make sure if things do not necessarily turn out as positive as we want, that we can make that happen? How do we make free trade agreements more gender equal?
Thank you very much. I think we've got one more comment from Imna, and then we will come back to your question. Yes, Inma, would you just like to add your comment?
Now, okay, thank you very much for both questions. And now I will try to answer you because it's key what you have asked. Well, the problem we faced first is to be able to include provisions, or at least a chapter, as in Chile is, in order to, the first thing is to make society conscient how important is the role of trade policy, and particularly free trade agreements, in the way women can empower and can benefit from free trade agreements, from exports and trade arrangements. This is the first thing. And I think we are in the correct path, but as I said before, I think we have a long way to walk yet. And this is very, very important in order to assess and to be sure that the provisions we include are sufficient to make to comply with the objective we have. The first thing we need is a really powerful civil society organizations. In the new free trade agreements, we have a very important to the civil society in order to assess the evaluation and to monitor the impact of the free trade agreements. This is the role of domestic advisory groups. And in order to be effective, the role of these domestic advisory groups, we need a civil society organization very, very engaged on this. We need very powerful women organizations. It's very, very important. I think this is the case of Chile and Mexico. We have very good women organizations, but we have to provide the framework in order they can work. This is very important. I think we are asking, for instance, to the European Commission to provide with more resources to civil societies in third countries in order they can make a good job, because they have the possibility to be involved on the evaluation and monitoring of the free trade agreements. This is a very important issue, because you have to imagine what difficult it is for some organizations to go to the capital of the countries, and for instance, if it is the case of Chile, to go to Santiago in order to hold meetings, in order to have the possibility to make the progress on the assessments. And you have to think also about that some of them, they don't have the connectivity infrastructures we have in order to be able to hold telematic meetings as I am doing now. Then is these two things are very, very important. And the other thing is very, very important, the role of the parliament, of the monitoring groups and intercommittee, and the hearings in intercommittee. And in this case, it is very, very important to monitor in this on how important are the free trade agreements on gender. But I have to tell you something. Tomorrow, as I told you before, we are going to hold a hearing on gender perspective, gender and trade. This is something, we are three coordinators from the three different political groups in intercommittee in charge of gender mainstreaming. One from the left, one from the Greens, and one from S&D, that's I myself. I'm sure that tomorrow there will be very few people in interroom in order to follow these hearings. Particularly in my case, I will have to follow it also by a video conference, by a webinar, because for personal reasons, I can be in Brussels today and tomorrow. But I ask you to follow the meeting, and you can be sure that we have to make much more from this side, from European side, in order to be able to put gender and trade agenda in the top, because this is not the case yet. And this is something, this depends on women, because men, sadly, they are not really as engaged on this as we should. Then I think it's all of these things we have to work by our side, on the side of the Commission, and helping the civil society organizations in third countries to make possible the role they have to do.
Thank you, Inma. I have one question or comment by Anne Lind.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that the question from you from Denmark was very interesting. When I was Minister of Trade, we decided we need to have a feminist trade policy. And that was very difficult because one of the issues were you don't have disaggregated data. And that means that you have around 1/3 of the women are not in any system. So they have the statistics just for persons. And that might be good from an intersectional point of view, but it's not good if you want to know how women are not treated in the right way. So the first thing we had to do was to find disaggregated data. And then we found what you said in the beginning about the pink tariffs, that there were actually 30% more tariffs on silk blouses for women than on the exact same blouses, or they call it shirt, for men. And also when it comes to sportswear, when we find the disaggregated data, and I don't talk about sports bra, but if you talk about sports tanks and trousers and things, they were much, much higher tariffs on women's sportswear than men. So what we did was to develop together with UNCTAD a toolbox to be used when you are writing trade agreements on how trade policies affect men and women differently. But this toolbox is a little bit difficult. It's made for those who negotiate it. So if you want to really make a gender analysis of all the trade agreements, you need them to use it. You cannot just say you have to look at how it's affect men and women differently if you don't have a toolbox, but it's there. And we also managed in the Ministerial Conference 11, the WTO Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires, to take the first ever Women and Trade resolution. Now it's the MC13 coming up in February in Abu Dhabi. So it's the second after it. And I wonder how many governmental delegation will hold the WTO accountable to what we have agreed upon. And if there is not a push, what have you done to fulfill the decision you took in Ministerial Conference 11 at the Ministerial Conference 13? How many will be held accountable for, are you using the toolbox that is there for trade and to implement trade in a way that is gender equal? But if people don't know that this exists, if there are people and NGOs are not pushing for it, there will be no use that we have developed these kinds of tools. So I hope that with in this whole, when we are doing these whole projects, we will spread information about tools and decisions that are actually already there and that can be used.
Thank you very much, Anne Lind. This is a very important comment, also pointing to the crucial role of the WTO that we should follow during the years to come. But I have one more question to Inma before you have to leave. Coming back to the point of enforceability that was raised in the audience, how can we make gender-specific provisions in FTAs in the European Union more enforceable?
Okay, very quickly, because I have to leave in 1 minute. But I think it was very interesting, the words of the ex-minister from Foreign Affairs in Sweden, because I fully agree with you have said. Well, how we can make enforceable? Well, I think it's very important first to have the conscience, the awareness from Commission to do that. And I think it's something that it takes a long time. It has improved, but it's not enough, as I said on initial speaking. And I think we need the problem of disaggregated data is also something I mentioned at the beginning, is crucial, because if not, we can't do an impact assessment. And it's always it's a round circle, because we don't have impact assessment. Is not considered how important is the enforcement of the provisions on gender. No, we have to break with this circle. I have to mention that in the former legislature, together with the former coordinator of S&D, it was an Italian, Alessia, and myself, we worked together with International Trade Center and the DigiTrade in order to prepare a budget to try to start with a more disaggregated data. We started to do that, but the problem we have is when I think from the European Union point of view, it's better the disaggregated data we have, but when you have to do the same in third countries, when we have to assess how the trade is impacting gender, the problem is that they have less disaggregated data as European Union has. Then it's very difficult to do that. Then that's why I think it's so important to have the implications and engagement of the domestic advisory groups, the role of civil society in providing us information in concrete cases about the situation of how the free trade agreement is helping or not, or discriminating women. And also we have to take into account that it's not only a matter of trade policy, but it's a very important matter of national policies. When you have a government that is very involved in to try to resolve gender inequalities, and there is a coordinating of trade and national policies in order to resolve the gap we still exists, is the way we have to work. Then it's a very complex situation is a matter of very horizontal policies that have to work together in a very well coordinated way, and public and private cooperation is crucial, because if not, it's going to be very difficult. We have achieved some issues, but we have to work very, very much to be able to assess the reality and then to improve the provisions we introduce in free trade agreements and in general in trade policy. Not only in free trade agreements, but also in all what is referring to trade defense instruments, because we have to know how women are more affected by countries that they are applying dumping, and they are difficulty in pushing trade barriers to small enterprises that are more for women rather than for men. This is a very important issue, I think. And now I have to say you goodbye. I'm really sorry because I can't stay more time. I think it has been a very, very interesting interchange of views. It was a pleasure to have the opportunity to hear all of you and to share this panel with these two important panelists. And I hope we can work together in the future also. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Inma. Thank you very much. Okay, so first of all, I would like to ask the two of you whether you have anything to add to the last comments of Inma.
Thank you so much for the interesting discussion and very to-the-point questions. I think this is really a key question. You were also talking about it. How do we hold policies accountable? How do we hold companies accountable? And that's a very important question. I think what our MEP Ima was talking about was really about the awareness-raising aspect, and that is currently where we are in terms of gender in the European Parliament, raising the awareness. But of course, where we want to end is the discussion of, what are our binding regulations in terms of gender equality, in terms of human rights. So that is really in the discussion right now with the due diligence, for example, a more binding law, international law for companies. That would be one step, but I think that is the direction that we need to think of. And we can have actually success in that sense if we are able to strengthen our international law, because in trade policy you have binding resolutions that are also having a lot of benefits for companies, not so much for human rights activists. But we need to make these spaces of holding them account to human rights and to women's rights, the CEDAW Convention. We were talking about what's happening in Chile. I would like to mention, for example, one concrete example in which our civil society in Chile was able to stand up for the human rights. There was, I think this year, a recent case where they used the CEDAW Convention and one on indigenous rights to stop lithium extractivism and to really make clear that this should be only happening if it's benefiting or respecting human rights and respecting nature. So they were very successful in lithium, in stopping this company. And sadly, and I think this is interesting when we're talking about what our strategies are forward. On the one hand, indeed awareness raising, but also I think importantly to look at the trade policy in a holistic manner, because we can do lots in discussions, but at the same time, for example, with Chile, there's a lot of discussion in a certain circle, but there's no discussion about the impact of lithium extractivism. So that's kind of not seen as a gendered issue. It's not seen as a women's rights issue. So I think there are lots of barriers still to break down, and also from a feminist perspective, feminists has been there since the beginning of the WTO in 1999. There were already feminists standing on the streets to ask for accountability from the WTO. There has been lots of research that is available. There are a lot of case studies that are accessible. If we go, for example, to the WTO, and we are not allowed to go and speak in one of the panels because we don't represent the narrative of trade benefiting women. So I think there's a lot of political issues that we need to address when the talk comes to a feminist trade policy. Awareness raising is one step, but we still have many steps to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I would finish by saying I think the two main areas are sort of assessment and enforcement, and how you ensure when you're trading, signing off a trade deal, they're in there in the chapter as well, so that another government can't come and wipe them out. Because, you know, if you sign off something best practice, you want it to stay and to stick. The second thing I would say is, I think for us who do care about women's rights and the impact of trade on women's rights, we need to think very carefully about the sort of increasing protectionism in global politics, because obviously the biggest sort of challenge to liberalisation and so on has really been this big move from the US on the Inflation Reduction Act. And we need to have a bit more of this kind of discussion about how our values are reflected in that, because I can imagine that if we're not careful, protectionism will protect a lot of men's jobs internal to a country, for example, steel jobs or certain jobs in the US, coal mining, for example, but then it may not necessarily protect women in the same way. So we end up with the same question, regardless of if we're free traders or protectionists. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. My name is Alice Ridge. I'm from the International Women's Development Agency based in Australia, and we also convene the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. Through that work, we published a paper recently by Naila Kabir and Sarah Cook, sort of unpacking the concept of GDP from a feminist perspective. And it really strikes me listening to what you're talking about, that so much of this is bound up in our conception of the economic system. And I guess I'm just interested in reflections on, you know, we want to, as feminists, I think we work inside systems to try and maximise outcomes for women, but we also want to change those systems. And so I'm interested in your reflections on, yeah, how we can sort of change the broader economic system that trade operates within. Sorry, it's a very big question.
Yeah, and a very good one too. So would you like to start with this, or should we get another question? Any comments right away? Okay, so I think there was a hand raised over there that I've overlooked several times.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question from the point of view of political parties. I don't know if you have this data, but do you think that this area is actually one of the few continuity areas we can see from left and wing governments? And I'm asking this because in the case of Chile, actually, the gender and trade perspective is one of the few that we were able to maintain from a left to a right, and now again to a left government. I don't know if the case of Chile is an accident or you can see a trend there. I'm asking because I don't know that area that well.
I don't mind going first. Yep. Do you want me to go first this time? This time I can go first. I think some of those questions come down to when I was talking about the 3 Ps, the people part, because it can be very well led by a woman, but also you need women within the sort of both sides of a trade deal to ensure that there is best policy practice. It was a bit like Peymana's first question about what do you do if a system or a culture isn't right. Then you have to start with that whole system or that whole culture to ensure that there's equity at the heart of it. And I think it's the same in trade policy. And I think you have to continually ensure as you go towards the next trade deal or the next chapter in any trade discussion that you still got a sort of women-centred approach, because often it can just take a change of leadership or a slight change of the makeup of the negotiators and you've lost all the progress that you made. And that was why I think the New Zealand example was very good, because it was signed off under a Labour government, and I couldn't imagine the current New Zealand Labour government, which was voted in a week ago, putting in a feminist chapter in the trade deal. So I do think it's part of that sort of holistic approach to get some sort of givens or some, acquis, if you like, into the process, but it also does depend on the leadership of who's leading that trade arrangement. On your point, which is a much bigger one about GDP and general economics for women, class number 1, I think it's a really, really important debate, particularly at the moment around inflation, for example. And we have a very lively debate in the UK because the Governor of the Bank of England basically said all workers need to pull their belts in because it's really important that we don't let inflation get out of control. And then when the data came out, it showed that all of the growth was in the bonuses from the banks. If anybody knows how lacking in balance the UK economy really is. And I think it's just really important that at every sort of challenge we unpack that data so that we are being true to the people we serve as parliamentarians and making sure that working people are gaining those any positive policy developments, because my experience is it's always the people at the bottom of the pile who are getting the impact of inflation, the impact of high housing costs, the impact of milk and bread in the shops, the impact of school shoes for children going through the roof and every other thing. And I think it's very important not just to think about GDP, even though it's a nice shorthand for how our economy is doing, but also to have different perspectives. And I often find that within the UK, the trade unions do some very good research which drills down into sectors so that you can see which sector is the worse off. And it's almost always women's jobs, whether it's in local government, whether it's in businesses, whether it's in SMEs. It always seems to be that women are really struggling to maintain their sense of progress.
Thank you. Two also very important questions. Maybe to start with the more specific one on where the left is positioning. I think maybe the one on Chile is a bit of an exception. I know there's a huge resistance against the EU-Mercosur agreement also from some of the countries. There was a very critical speech this year of Lulu on the progress of this negotiation. The EU-Mexico is similar. There's lots of pushback from civil society and also discussions in Mexico. I can go on, but I think specifically when we look at asymmetrical trade relationships, there is quite some pushback from civil society. I think it will be different if you look at EU-Japan or EU-New Zealand that has been negotiated, or Canada. Specifically, of course, the system change question is a very important question. I think when we look at trade policy right now, there is this assumption that a neoliberalization will bring us benefits, but it's also untested. So there have been also moderate economists showing that actually when you look at GDP growth in its traditional sense, we don't really see this huge benefits for many countries that are in the lower and middle income range. So I think that is really a lot of burden on our politicians to prove that GDP actually is really in the best way increased. From a feminist perspective, of course, we have a lot of questions about this concept. And it is very important to look at the system change in our global alliance on gender, the Gender Trade Alliance. We also have a lot of discussions. Should you go into more like policy spaces, or should we really promote activism from outside of these policy spaces? That's an ongoing discussion. Probably both are needed. But I think it's important for feminists, but I often see that there are lots of feminists on all kinds of topics, that we also claim the topic of economics as one of a feminist topic, and that we claim this as something that we have a lot of knowledge on and don't leave it up to trade experts or other experts, but really claim it as our own. I think that's a very first step.
Thank you. So I think we're running out of time, so we will come to an end. We end at 3 o'clock, right? Yes, okay. So just perhaps as a way of concluding this session, I thought maybe you could provide our participants with a communicative tool so when somebody comes up to them and asks them, okay, what's feminist trade policy about? Do you have a short summary of 1 or 2 sentences for them?
Well, what's the impact on a woman's everyday life of a particular trade policy, and having that in your mind when you're sitting at the negotiating table? and trying to see that across the different societies and across the different contexts.
That was very spontaneous. Thank you.
I think you said it all, but yeah, I think that's a really good definition. So.
Thank you very much for discussing feminist foreign trade policy with us, and I hope we have a very enjoyable coffee break and a lot more opportunity to discuss questions and a great rest of the day. Thanks.